to bring your full self. That's
Right.
a lot.
Absolutely. Well, I wanted to comment on what you named about this guard. So to me, the guard is actually not necessarily a negative thing,
Mhm.
because if we live in a dangerous world, we need to some type of protection.
Mhm.
So the way that I like to think about it is like, how is that guard functioning, right? So if this guard is protecting me from, racist onslaughts, uh, you know, then I think it's actually a very helpful thing for Black men to have. Now, I think when it's not helpful is when it prevents us from connecting deeply with ourselves and our emotional experiences, so that there's never a moment in our lives when we're able to be authentic with ourselves and care deeply for our experiences in the world. And so I remember I was watching, it must have been like a National Geographic channel or whatnot. Sometimes, you have everything on YouTube. And so it was one of these nights where like this video came up on YouTube, and I was intrigued by it, right? And part of what it was naming was that there's this one species of a tree that it over time, the environment got very dangerous for this species of tree, because it got colder, and it would not be able to survive if it did not adapt. So essentially, this tree, it adapted. So excuse me. So the ways that it actually grew adapted to its environments. And so to me, that's similar to the importance of this guard up. So if I know that I'm constantly in this world that's discrediting me, that devalues me, that always sees me as a boy, no matter how old I am, right? Then I need to know how to interact with that world so that I can, first of all, survive, and then two, experience healing and flourish.
I I say often that guard, though, yes, it's necessary. Um, but sometimes it's even the guard is up even with our own, even amongst ourselves, our own people. And so I guess that's where I was kind of leading to, how can we
Yeah, that's
engage
a
that? Yeah.
that's a really good point. So the way that I look at that is, I go back to practical experiences, right? I mean, so yeah, I've studied and all these things, but the thing that's truest to me is experiences with people, like what's happening on the ground.
Mhm.
What are we experiencing with Black folks in the community, um, Black women, Black men, Black non gender identifying people, right? Like, how are they experiencing life? And and what I think about is that every single time that I've connected with a Black person, certainly, Black men um, in the community, in a therapeutic space, um, when when we have enough time for them to feel like they're supported and that they can be vulnerable
Mhm.
and very authentic,
Yeah.
I never had the issue of them putting up a guard.
Yeah.
I mean, like that's as real as day, right? In the sense that when I think about this notion of guard up, I think it's important to reflect on at least two things. One, what are the historical and contemporary reasons why Black men have up guards?
Mhm.
Like,
Mhm.
in what ways has the world not been safe? And then two, you talk about, okay, Black men have guards up even in the midst of their own, as far as the Black community. Well, two, it's important to reflect on how are we as a community relating to Black men?
Right, right, right.
Because again, my experience, like over and over again, is that when we nurture a space for Black men to be heard, felt, and understood, one of the things I mentioned in my book was how, after a lot of times, when the Black men in my book would tell their story and we'll be having this conversation in our interview, um, they would oftentimes end the conversation by saying, "Yeah, like you feel me." You feel me? I mean, they
Mhm.
said it like over and over again, right? And
Yeah,
so one of the things that I raised in the book was perhaps that riff off of you feel me is from this perspective that the world does not feel Black men.
mhm. Mhm.
So even sometimes our own communities don't
Yeah.
feel Black men
Right.
in their
Right.
experiences.
Right.
And so I want to be very clear. Like I'm saying, hey, we need to definitely dismantle, the patriarchal ways of being Black and male, the Black machoistic ways of being Black and male that are oppressive to Black women and other people in the Black community. And what I'm saying is that we need to do a better job of feeling life as Black men feel it. Because again, they're saying, hey, you feel me?
Yeah. Yeah. So I'd like to take this time to open up to see if there's any comments or remarks that others would like to present, or any questions at this time.
Reverend Di, let me jump in before everybody else does. And Dr. Greer, it's absolutely wonderful to see you and
Likewise.
and to hear the beginning of what is really going to be a profound time together with you over the next few weeks. I want to echo your sentiments and thank Reverend Di for the incredible work that she has done in helping to put this together. And I also want to say that the subject matter obviously is near and dear to my heart since I've been a Black man for 61 years. That's all I know. And the issues that I think you're bringing up, it seems to me is very much it's almost like you're an amazing artist and you're just and you're pulling back layers. You're pulling back layers. And I think that what has happened is that time and experience and the prodigious amount of pain that Black people in general have experienced has put those layers on.
Yes, that's
And
right.
when I think about it, I think about our history, and of course, I think that we don't want to play into the machoism that you talked about, and a man is a man and all of that. But
Right.
historically, men were deemed to be responsible for being providers and carers for their people and for their family. And when Black men were introduced to the Western Hemisphere as a part of the African slave trade, all of that was taken away, was snatched away. So for thousands of years, we are the providers and we are the caretakers for our own, and that included our families, our women, our children, and all of that. And that was taken away. And not only was it taken away, but it was kept away. So we're talking about 240 years of slavery now. We're talking about the aftermath of that in terms of Jim Crow, and now we're talking about racism having seeped into everything in our society, structural and all of that. So there are still every kind of mechanism exists to try to deny Black men from assuming that responsibility of being a caretaker and a provider. And this, you see, I think for me has affected everything. It's affected the way we view ourselves. It's affected the way we view God. So there's a real theological issue that's going on there. It's the way we view society. It's the way we view the world. So I want to end this by saying I read an article just today, the latest in the Christian Century magazine. It was an interview with William Jennings, and William Jennings is a pretty profound African-American professor of systematic theology and Africana studies at Yale University. And this article was about the geography of whiteness. And what Jennings does is he goes back to the very beginning as well, but he looks at racism, and I'm going to put that in the context of Black males, and says that not only is racism responsible for so much, but the white people who are racist themselves don't understand how they too have been taken advantage of. So we're talking about white Christianity now. He talks about how they stole the story, from the Hebrews and created it and made their own story that created this horrible reality that we're facing right now. So one of the things that as a faith community, I'd like you to touch on a little bit is theologically, how do we encourage Black men to continue to believe in a God who has been with us every step of the way, even though that God and the tradition of Christianity has been so baseless in its attempt to destroy us as a people?
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think about the significance of Ubuntu, which I write about in my chapter on spirituality in the book. And that, we must embrace this notion that I am because we are. And our spirituality must be about that. So part of what I, engage is to say that, hey, building off the work of, Almeda Wright, who's also, at Yale Divinity School, she has this concept of this integrated spirituality versus this fragmented spirituality. And so, as I talk about what for me is a hope to keep going spirituality, it's got to be a type of spirituality that integrates all of life into it, so that like it actually makes sense to Black men to engage this type of spirituality, because they can then see the benefits of this type of spirituality that actually affects my emotional life, my psychological life, my material reality, so that the only way that I find it helpful to embody spirituality is to think about it from the perspective of how is it functioning for us. One of my colleagues who once taught at Claremont School of Theology, but she's now going on to perhaps greener pastures and at the University of Denver. But Monica Coleman, one of the things that as we connect, she often talks about is what does it mean to have a faith that liberates? And so I think that in order for spirituality to be helpful for Black men, it has to be a spirituality that liberates us from whatever type of oppressive, constraining situation that we're a part of. And thinking about this whole notion of, the work of, Anthony Penn and the ways that he talks about how Black religion and Black faith has been helpful. He asked the question, what is this something more that we can strive for, outside of this whatever limiting circumstances we're experiencing. So for me, spirituality, faith for Black men must nurture a type of striving to not be limited to the constraints of all of the isms.
Yeah, thank you.
Mm-hmm. I think you're muted, Reverend Johnson.
That was my question as well, is how with the local faith community, particularly the Black church, support? What steps can we take to support our men and help the community overall? What does that look like? And to have a liberating faith, what does that really entail to bring that forward? And so
so my particular field of pastoral theology, care and counseling, it takes very seriously like this integration of theology and psychology in order to care deeply and holistically for people. And so as I think about the psychological dimensions of it, and I want to be clear that when we talk about the psychological dimensions, well, from an African perspective, like there is no distinction, let's say, between like the psychological and the spiritual, right? I mean, like that's the whole Western framework. And so when I talk about the psychological, I'm thinking about it in context of spirituality as well. But for the sake of like really focusing in on the part of ourselves that thinks and makes sense of reality, well, it's important, for Black men to be able to believe in something greater than any like oppressive situation that I might face in this life, right? So the ways in which, I mean, you even look at the civil rights movement, the ways in which we were able to believe in a God that was greater than Jim Crow and any oppression that we faced, like that fueled us to believe that something better is, like, I know that something better is possible, right? Because I serve a God who's on my side, who's on our side. And so I think that's a very significant part of our faith, right? Is to say that, yeah, like one of the benefits of our faith is to be able to believe in something that's much more powerful than any limiting oppressive circumstance in this world.
Yeah.
Very good.
And Dr. Greer and Reverend Dye, I think, now I don't know if you all agree with me or not, and I don't know if any of our other folks on the line agree with me tonight, but I think that we are at an incredibly important juncture in human history when it comes to our faith as a people. And that's with regard to this pandemic. That's with regard to how we have been compelled and forced to not only engage in our understanding of church and service differently than we've ever done before, because we're outside of the building. But that also helps us to engage and see God differently as well. So, we're planning on mounting a wonderful comeback, a re-emerging Reverend Greer in the month of December. But I've been sharing with folks that it's not a return to anything that we've had before. It is something that is different. And I think that the positive blessing of that is understanding how we have had church outside of the walls for 20 months means that's what we should have probably been doing all the time. And then we gather together, for praise and worship on Sunday. So we don't want to just leave that. And tonight is an example of how we're able to reach people that we would not ordinarily be able to meet coming into the sanctuary on Sunday. And we're doing this over and over again. And I think we can focus, Dr. Greer, if you help us, I guess, on developing modules for Black men where they are, not just in Evanston, but in Metro Chicago and throughout the country.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah.
So if there's not any other question, I have a question in the chat. This is from Reverend Journey. Can get it here? 1 second. Bear with me. Dr. Greer, can you speak more to the insights of your book that pushes the theology within the Black church to establish more liberative yet critical spaces for Black men? For example, Dr. Journey says, how do we move beyond misogynoir in ways that also help Black men?
I'm sorry, the connection was out. Can you ask the question again? I didn't hear the whole thing.
Can you speak? Can you provide more insights? Can you speak more to the insights of your book that pushes the theology within the Black church to establish more liberative yet critical spaces for Black men?
Right. So in terms of developing this type of critical stance that stands against misogyny. I have a chapter that focuses on the urgency for Black men to embody empathy and support for Black women, right? And for me, that's a very critical part of what it means to nurture the flourishing of Black men. And so, for instance, one of the things, and I'll share this on my PowerPoint. So one of the things that came out of conversations with Black men in my book was that there was a theme in which they saw Black women essentially as existing, for the pleasure that Black women can bring Black men. Now, this is not to say that in loving relationships that there's not pleasure that both partners, can bring, to one another. What I am saying is that I find it problematic when we can have, Black male identities in the church that relate to women in such a way that women are just servicing, the needs of Black men in the community without caring deeply for the needs of and the well-being of Black women. So that's one of the things that I'm very passionate about arguing for, is that, hey, we need to dismantle these ways of being, Black and male that don't take seriously nurturing the well-being of Black women in the community, and not just for what Black women can do for us as Black men. The other thing is that, as I'm reflecting in the book, so I have this diagram, and hopefully you all have your copies of the book, or will get you a copy of the book. But when you look at a copy of one of the diagrams in the book, the middle circle is a circle that I named Constantly Becoming Woke. And what I mean by that is that we must, as a community and individuals, constantly be reflecting on, what might we be participating in right now that might be harming, that might be oppressive to someone or to other groups. So for me, that critical lens to always reflect on like what might we be missing, I find to be very helpful.
Okay. Are there any other questions? Let's see. I have nothing in the chat just yet. Would you like to, share some of your presentation, and maybe that will prompt a little bit more dialogue?
Absolutely. So I've got a PowerPoint to share with us. Before I do that, I just wanted to make sure, does anyone have a question or a comment before we get into the PowerPoint?
Well, Dr. Greer, I know I've got to get your book and read your book.
Yeah.
So I'm
Dr.
waiting to get your book.
Yeah. I diddle that, Tom. Dr. Greer, I remember, I think you may have posted this earlier this year. You ran into a personal experience. I think it may have been in an airport and on an airplane or something like that. And I think that I can't remember the whole story, but as I read it, I have this sense and feeling that experience was probably typical of what many Black men go through.
Yes.
And the way that you handled it and dealt with it, I thought was just marvelous in terms of the way you articulated that. Does that make sense for you to share that at some point here?
Absolutely. Well, I mean, now is the perfect time.
Okay.
And so, yeah, thank you for bringing that up, because so I want to be clear that like none of us talks from a vacuum, right? Like we all have our own experiences, when we do the work that we do. And those necessarily affect the ways in which we experience life and the ways in which we do the work that we do. And so unfortunately, Pastor Neighbors, you're like, you weren't sure if it was in the airport or somewhere else. So I'm like, yes, all of the above, right? And it's sad that it has to be multiple experiences, right? So I definitely had an experience at an airport. One of the more recent ones was at a rental car place, here in Portland. And so, so you all know, I teach at Claremont School of Theology. Currently, we've got this 2-campus model, in Southern California and in here in Oregon. And so I'm living here in Portland now. And so I was having a good Saturday morning, right? Like I'm just thinking, for one day, I feel like as a Black man, I've been able to overcome some of the obstacles of this life and to be able to breathe, right? And so this Saturday morning, so, I live, close to the riverfront. So I was walking from that part of town towards a grocery store. I thought I'd just, on a Saturday morning, take a stroll in my neighborhood, walk to the grocery store, come back, and have everything I need. Well, on the way to the grocery store, I decided to stop at a rental car place. And this rental car place, when I, asked the guy, about, I was trying to stop by to ask for rates, right? And so this white gentleman, opens up the door, and you could tell from the very beginning, he didn't want me to be there. And so he looks at me, he says, "Do you have a reservation?" I said, "Oh, well, I don't have a reservation, but I'm looking at, checking into your rental car rates because, I'm interested in renting a car, for instance, if I might want to drive up to Seattle and, other, business type things." And then he says, "Well, we don't have rates." And I said, "You don't have rates?" I said, "Well, can you at least give me a range of it?" And then he says, "No." Right? I'm okay. This guy's been very short with me, not very respectful at all. And so we go back and forth. And then he says, "Well, when do you want to rent a car?" I said, "Well, as I mentioned, I'm checking in to see what your general ballpark for rates might be, for whenever I do." So I already mentioned in the beginning of the conversation that I didn't have a specific date, right? But I was just checking in. Long story short, he goes back and forth and he gets, upset. And then when I wasn't leaving, because I was like, "Sir, do you not at least have a ballpark?" He then aggressively shuts the door on my face. And I started to just walk away. It shouldn't matter that I was dressed with a hoodie, tennis shoes, and I wasn't dressed like this. Like, it shouldn't matter that I wasn't dressed like this, right? he should have respected any human being who was in that space. So when he's pulled the door on me, I started to walk away, and then I thought about my Black niece and other people who Black folks who will follow after me, and I could not imagine this same person and people like him thinking that he can get away with doing this to my niece and other Black folks in the future generations. So just my automatic response was, being real part of me said, there's no way in the world that this dude is stronger than I am. So I then pulled the door back, and I think that scared him, right? That like I pulled the door back, but I said, well, sorry, that was disrespectful. The fact that you shut the door on me. And then of course, as you can imagine, he really became afraid in that moment. And he escalated to the point where he said, I'm calling the cops on you. And so he ended up calling the cops. He had an accomplice behind him. There's a white woman who was like cheering him on, and she never heard anything about that conversation, right? But she was just talking to me as if I was not a human being. She was like, "You need to leave now," and I was like, "Whoa, wait a minute! What did I do to cause you to tell me to leave now?" In the aggressive tone in which she was telling me, and so then I start to record. Luckily, I had my phone on me, so I started to record a video of it, and I could tell when I started recording this the white woman who was cheering him on. She then recognized the situation and that she was going to be recorded, and so she kind of backed down a little bit, not too much, but you could tell she started to change her language. And so when she realized that all I wanted was rates, she then went behind the counter and she said, "All right, sir," and kind of like threw up her hands, almost like I had a gun on me, right? I mean, like that's part of the reality is like being a Black male. It's like you walk in as you're a threat, as if you have a gun on you, even if you don't have one, right? So she goes back, she's like, "All right, sir, if all you want is rates," like, and she starts typing on her computer to find rates. I'm like, wait a minute, if like that's all you had to do in the beginning, like what was the big problem? The guy just told me you don't have rates, right? And so I finished this conversation with this guy, the white guy who called the cops on me, and he says, well, I'm calling the cops on you, like the cops are on their way. And I said, okay, what are the cops going to do when they get here? And he says, oh, they're going to arrest you. And I said, okay, why are they going to arrest me? He's like, because you're being aggressive and you're being a threat and you're trespassing. And keep in mind, I was still outside of the store. Like hadn't even come into the store yet, right? We were just having this conversation, at the door. And so, my sense is as a Black person, you have to be able to read situations quickly. So as these two, SUV squad cars aggressively approach me, they come up on the curb. I was able to read them quickly and see, at least in that moment, I was like, okay, these guys at least seem like I can have a conversation with them without them shooting, right? And so, I read them really quick, and then I, finished having my conversation with the guy at the rental car place. Again, luckily I had the video, I had evidence, and so I showed it to the police. And luckily in that case, they were, at least one of them I know for sure was on my side, and he saw the video and he started shaking his head and he's like, oh gosh, he was like, it's a shame this keeps happening when there's so much evidence, of other videos like this. And so he found out that I was a professor, at Claremont School of Theology at Willamette University, which is, in the state's capital in Salem, Oregon. And so, Willamette is a private university. It's the first university in the West. So at least in Oregon, it's a pretty respected university. And so, he went to Portland State University, but as I was talking with him, he was somewhat reminiscing. He was like, man, like, I applied to Willamette and I went to Portland State, but like, I really wanted to go to Willamette. He was like, man, they had really good conversations down there. And it's so cool. It's so cool that you're a professor down there. So I remind you that the white guy who called the cops on me said that when the cops get there, that they were going to arrest me. Like this was his expectation. What actually happened was this almost turned out to me having like a mentoring conversation with this younger white cop who just graduated from college last year. Total different expectation that this white guy had compared to actually what happened, what unfolded, right? So, yeah, so I'm writing and I'm speaking and reflecting from some of those lived experiences as well.
Yeah. Rev, thank you for sharing that, Dr. Greer. And it's to me to hear it, it's just another horrifying incident that could have ended very
Right.
differently than the
That's
way
right.
that it did. And that's why if we don't do anything else in the church, we have to be prayerful of our younger generation, and we have to also listen to them, including you, and also share any kind of advice that we can, because I think that incident happens every day all around our country and world.
That's right. That's right.
Mhm.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, Reverend Johnson, you invited me to share the PowerPoint, so let me share the PowerPoint with everyone now. So I want to just continue in this flow, but I wanted to make sure that we had a chance to, have conversation, dialogue with one another as we get into this PowerPoint. All right. Each time we have a Zoom conversation like this, I try to get faster at sharing my screen. So let's see how fast I can get it going today.
Yeah.
All right. All right, so here we are. If you all can see this, can you just give me a thumbs up? Excellent, perfect. All right, so as I started earlier, we're talking about a community conversation on Black men, right? It has to be a community approach. And I'm very, for me, I'm very clear that this conversation is beneficial not just for Black men, but the entire Black community, so that we can nurture liberated views of being Black and male. All right. So before we go further, I love the way that PowerPoint now has this feature where you just type something in and it gives you these creative slides, right? So, I mean, you don't need to be super impressed by me for creating these creative slides, but PowerPoint just has this amazing feature now where you just type something in and it gives you these beautiful, colorful slides. So here you go right here. And so I just wanted to name that, I would love to stay connected. One way that certainly you can stay connected with me is by checking out our website, nicholasgreer.com, where I share blogs and other events and things that are happening. There you can also see my book and find ways to get a copy of that as well. All right, so I want to talk about the flow of our 3-week series. And when Reverend Johnson and I were talking, I was like, I'm not sure 1 week is going to do it, right? the experiences of Black folks in our community are they're so comprehensive, and there's so much complexity to it that we need time to unpack it. And I'm still not convinced that 3 weeks is enough time. In fact, I know it's not to nurture a communal healing, as well as the survival and flourishing of Black men. But what I am passionate about is to believe and to know that within the folks who were gathered in this space, as we had this virtual conversation, that we've got power, right? We've got power to nurture the well-being of Black folks throughout our communities. So in these 3 weeks, I believe that we'll be able to engage resources and ways of thinking about care for Black communities and care for Black men that can help us to develop, strategies and approaches that will actually help our communities and Black men to both survive and ultimately flourish. So week 1, really want to talk about building on our strengths, the importance of flourishing and the obstacles to it. Week 2, again, tell your folks that you don't want to miss it because we're in here really being passionate about nurturing a communal approach to caring for Black men next week. The 3rd week, we want to take very seriously, what does it mean to help individual Black men survive and flourish? And so this follows some of the flow of my book. Again, you'll have to get the whole book to get the whole scope of it. But essentially, I tried to pull out some of the important themes from the book that I think will be helpful for us to engage in this discussion for the next 3 weeks. So specifically, week 2 and week 3, these mirror the ways that I'll talk about both a communal model as well as an individual model to nurture the well-being of Black men. The reason why I say both are necessary is because for me, first of all, community, like that's the most important thing, right? Because too often, like people put the blame at individuals, but for me, it's clear that a word that we like to use sometimes is the pathology, or in other words, like the thing that's wrong with us as people is often found, and most often found in the social structures, the systemic oppression and all these things that cause us to suffer, right? So for me, like building off the work of people like Francis Fanon and others, like we must be about communal healing and communal justice, communal flourishing, right? Like that's how we can nurture flourishing of Black communities and Black men in an optimal sense. And then, I also have an individual model of change that I offer in the book, which is what we'll talk about in week 3. In other words, what are strategies and what are resources that are helpful for Black men to survive and ultimately flourish? And so one of the things that I focus on is to say that we need to think very clearly about how do we nurture the survival, the healing, the liberation, and ultimately the flourishing of Black men. And so these models that I'm presenting are ways to help us to accomplish that. And so for week 3, we're going to talk a lot about how do we, what are resources and what are ways of thinking that can be helpful for Black men to survive and ultimately flourish. All right, so let's get into week 1. So a goal of our 3-week series, is to engage in dynamic community conversation, community dialogue on the well-being of Black men, and begin pointing to practical next steps to designing and implementing a communal approach to caring for the well-being of Black men, Black women, and as I mentioned earlier, that this is done through nurturing Black male identities that are free of Black machoistic and Black sexist ways of being male, as well as caring for Black non-binary folks and the Black community as a whole. So essentially, this is a 2-step process, right? That I guess is organic, right? But in terms of our goals for this 3-week series, wanting to make sure that we have time to engage in dynamic dialogue, about the experiences of Black men and ways we can nurture their well-being, and then to move towards identifying what might be practical next steps for designing and implementing a communal approach to care for the well-being of Black men. All right, so I want to talk a little bit about flourishing. So true to when you look at Black psychology and even Black theology and the ways in which we as Black folks and Black clinicians, Black scholars think about who we are, we can't just start with slavery, right? Like that was not the beginning of our experiences, but rather there are our strengths that we have. There are beautiful ways of being together that we can remember. And so I'm connecting this to the ways in which both Evelyn Parker as well as Victor Anderson talk about flourishing. And so this is how I build my elements or definition of flourishing. And so for me, it was very important to read some of the work of Victor Anderson, where he's like, hey, we should not think about, or Black existence should not be tied only to suffering and then resisting that suffering. He's like, that's not the totality of our experiences. It should not be. He's saying, okay, yes, we need to help Black folks be able to resist anything that causes us to suffer. I mean, so resistance, that's always a part of our process, but that's not the only part of it, right? So, Victor Anderson is saying, hey, not only that, but everybody wants to flourish. Like, why can't Black people flourish as well? And so this is what I'm building on, as well as Evelyn Parker's ways that she talks about flourishing and what it means to flourish in our connection with the divine and with other people, right? So all these things, influence the ways that I think about flourishing. And so I say, for me, a Black person, and specifically in this case, Black men flourishing, means that we're talking about knowing and loving ourselves. We must feel supported by life-affirming community, which is one of the significant aspects of Black faith communities, right? Is that we have this already organized community that can nurture the well-being of folks in life-affirming ways, right? So this whole feeling supported by life affirming community, oh my gosh, like the church has an amazing ability to do this. And then commitment to life affirming relationships with the divine, God, other people, and self, right? And notice I mentioned self because like we can't leave self out of the equation. We have to have a life affirming view of ourselves. And in fact, I'm thinking about one of my clients, who happens to be a Black person, who was talking about the ways in which they have a different view of themselves than other people have of them. So it worked out in this case that other people view them in powerful ways, very life-giving ways, right? But this person, in large part because of like the negative messages that they received from oppression in society, like they had this very oppressive view of themselves, right? But what does it mean for us to have this life-affirming relationship with myself, right? I mean, that's a beautiful thing. So that to me is an important part of flourishing. And then relating to others with respect, empathy, and care. When I talk about empathy, I'm talking about feeling life as another person feels it. Another dimension of flourishing is acknowledging and valuing everyone's unique identity and gifts. So even within the Black community, we have to acknowledge that, hey, like everyone is not the same, that there's a difference in our communities. How can we acknowledge the different ways that people experience life and the different ways in which people have various identities and various gifts to bring to the table. And then having fair opportunities to thrive, right? Like that to me is a very significant part of flourishing, because if one is not given the opportunity, then they won't thrive. Like, in fact, I remember I was talking with one of the guys on the board of our law school at Willamette University. So I'm teaching a critical race theory seminar at the law school next semester. So I've been engaging in conversation with some of the folks at the law school. So this one guy who's on the board of the law school, he was, he happens to be a white guy. He was talking about the ways in which the system actually worked. So that he was like, the system worked in such a way that when he was coming up, as a beginning attorney, where as long as they knew each other, then they automatically were given the benefit of the doubt when advocating for a client, right? So, and again, example he gave me, he said, well, so we would all meet up at 7:00 in the morning at one of the local restaurants, and so a judge was there, other attorneys were there, and so we were all very good friends. And so he said that so when they had a case, when he would try to make the argument, he was like, before he could even really get into the argument, the judge will automatically say sustained. So he affirmed the argument before the person even got a chance to make the argument. So that, in other words, if you had a Black dude who was looking for justice, he wasn't going to get it because the judge was already on the side of the attorney, of his friend. And so that was not a fair opportunity to flourish when the judge has already made up his mind that this is a valid argument coming from this one attorney because I'm good friends with him. All right, and then other elements of flourishing. I say that for me, it's participating in society at the local, city, state, national, and/or global level. And then also another dimension of this is living life free from the grips of racism, sexism, homophobia, and any other ism. And another dimension of flourishing is to take proper care of one's body. I mean, when you think about it, at least in this lifetime, we've only got one body. And so too often, Black folks have not been believed and trusted by, medical professionals. And we often, there have been moments when we don't have cultures that take very seriously the care of our bodies. And so for me, this is a very significant dimension of flourishing. And then lastly, it's important to discover and connect with a life purpose bigger than oneself. Unfortunately, some folks talk about this as the pursuit of the bling, right? Where like one of the ways in which Black folks try to feel like somebody is to have certain material things, money, so that I can feel like, I belong in this human village, to the point sometimes where we forget that, Ubuntu is a thing. Like I should think about my flourishing in dialogue with the flourishing of other people. So if you look at one of the first pages in my book, right before the acknowledgments, I say to everyone in the human village, like, may we flourish, right? So to me, that's what we ought to be about. And so, we won't have time to talk about it here, but I encourage you to reflect on, what does the flourishing of Black men look like to you? So I just listed out 10 things that I see as important for Black men to flourish, but would love to for you to reflect on, what does, in your own words, what does Black flourishing look like for you, specifically Black male flourishing? All right, so I want to talk about the obstacles to flourishing, right? And so when we look at the fact that it's necessary to nurture the flourishing of Black men, well, is it kind of like this example, right, where we don't have soil all around us, but we've got concrete that prevents us from fully blossoming, right? So there are ways in which there are significant obstacles to Black men flourishing. In my book, I named these as being chronically disregarded, being chronically disrespected, discredited, feared, and devalued. So in other words, these were ways that men in my book, and these were all men who lived in the city of Chicago. So these were ways that they talked about being a Black man, that this was a part of their everyday realities, right? So so we often talk about chronic pain, chronic physical pain. What does it mean to think about chronic mental and emotional pain just for living life as a Black man? Like I can think about one of my colleagues here in Oregon. She's a Black woman who's an attorney. She did her law school degree at Yale Divinity School, right? Very successful in all these different ways that you can reflect on. And so as we were talking, when we first met, she shared with me the ways that her son committed suicide. And in fact, we had an event in Portland not too long ago. And so in fact, she was my conversation partner for the event. And after the event, she then sent me pictures of the suicide note that he left for her. And for everyone he wrote it to. In fact, he wrote it to Black people. It started out, "Dear Black people." And then she also sent me a picture of the noose that he was using to practice of how to hang and kill himself. And part of his letter said that this world said that I don't belong in it as a Black man. And so whenever I have these type of conversations, like, I'm thinking about his life and the words that he left in that letter, and the ways that, again, like, this is urgent, y'all. Like, this ain't nothing to play around with. Black folks are suffering, and it's time for us to rise up. We've risen up in the past, and we've done good work. And even as we've been tired, it's important for us to be well together and to continue to come together and strategize for ways that we can care deeply for Black men. So I think about his words, his experience, and his legacy, and to say that, hey, we can't afford to take a moment off in terms of caring deeply for Black men in the Black community. And when I say we can't afford to take a moment off, I'm also acknowledging that it's important for us to rest as well. So when I say it's that we can't afford to take a moment off, what I'm also saying is that we can't afford not to be strategic about how we live our lives. Meaning, we've got to be strategic about the rest that we get, so that we can rest, so that we can play, we can laugh, we can love, we can have joy, even as we continue this unapologetic fight to nurture the well-being of Black people. Another obstacle to flourishing is what is too often present in many Black men is the lack of empathy and care for Black women. Now, again, it's important for us to name the ways in which Black men have showed up, and the ways in which we are free from this Western sexist way of being Black and male, right? Because many of us have these matriarchal views of families and being Black and male, where we can be very nurturing and caring. And that doesn't take away from the fact that men I interview in my book often did not feel life as Black women feel it. And in fact, there are moments in which they would say certain things when I would ask them about what does it mean to be a Black, like what do they imagine it means to be a Black woman? Well, too often it was like a blaming Black woman for their experiences. And saying things like women have like misdirected thinking and things like that. Well, I'm like, wait a minute, like what about that is loving and nurturing, flourishing for our Black sisters, right? So it's important to name that as an obstacle for the ways in which Black men can flourish as free Black men. All right. Well, what are the ways in which Black men have been chronically dissed?
Dr. Greer.
Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm.
I want to give us a chance to just soak in what you've already outlined and give us just a few minutes. If there's anyone that wants to pose any question right here, or just have a moment to soak in what we've already received thus far. Anyone have any questions that were prompted?
I don't have a question, Reverend Dye. I just have a regret. Dr. Greer, we need 250 Black men on this call tonight. You know that, right? We're small in number tonight, but we're going to make a significant commitment for the next two sessions to have a much larger and robust and varied group, because what you're sharing is so excellent and so timely and so important for all of us that we just need to share it. And even for the sisters that are on the line, it's critical information for them, for the men who are in their lives as well. So I just wanted to share that. Yeah.
Thank you. Well, in the interest of time, I do want to share a few more slides because I left some time at the end for us to have some dialogue. I wanted to make sure we got a chance to get through everything. And so one of the things that's very important is to realize, like, again, the obstacles facing Black men. So one of the questions I asked the Black men in my book was, how do you imagine society views you and views Black men in general? And so one of the responses, so one of the things I named in the book was that, I'm sorry, that's a typo. It should be the men in the study. So the men in this book say that society believe Black men are not educated, they're dumb, they're criminals, violent, they're a threat, they're evil, thugs, and savages. So can you imagine what it's like to live life where like that's your perception of how people are looking at you, so that you're having to put so much energy into like resisting the fact that I know and I believe that people see me as not educated. I believe that people see me as dumb. I believe that people see me as criminal. I believe that people see me as violent, as a threat, as evil, as a thug, and as a savage, right? I mean, I can relate to a number of these things, right? And to the ways in which, even to the point that I can think about the ways that even unconsciously, I've tried to show up in certain spaces so that like people don't see me as not educated, or people don't see me as dumb, or people don't see me as a boy, or people don't see me as a criminal or violent, right? I mean, there are ways in which I have, even before I was fully aware about like the impact of racism on my life, there are ways in which I have given tremendous energy to prove these things wrong, right? And so when we think about caring for the mental health of Black men, we've got to acknowledge, like these are ways that Black men are imagining that people see them. And to be seen this way and to not be seen well, like that's detrimental. And then when we think about society's expectations of Black men, so one of the things I named is that Black men in this book express that society believes that Black men can only attain professional success as an entertainer, and that other successful life options are not available to Black men. So if you realize that like this is how the world sees me, and again, we thank God for the ways in which Black folks have been able to be successful financially and other ways as athletes, as entertainers, as artists, et cetera. I mean, that's beautiful, and we want to continue that. But part of the point I'm naming here is that that's very limiting when we don't make available a number of options for Black men to thrive. I mean, I can think about the ways in which even in my PhD program, like I didn't know, like within my immediate family, a person who had a PhD, right? And so like, I remember calling home to my mom one time in Atlanta when I was there in the Chicago area working on my PhD, especially when I first started. And I was like, yo, mom, we didn't use these words that they're using in this PhD program, right? So I'm not saying like a PhD is the only way to be successful, but my point is like that was not something that was normative in my life. And when we look at, what are society's view of the ultimate life destination of Black men, and this really, tore me up. And I will say a lot of the conversations that we had with Black men in the book really resonated and touched me deeply to the point where, I recorded the conversations with, of the Black men I interviewed, and there were several times where when I was trying to record, write down, transcribe the interviews, where I had to step away because I was in tears. I was like, this makes no sense. It makes no sense that this is a common theme amongst a number of Black men, like not just my life, but that they're suffering these ways emotionally, mentally, and otherwise. And I remember saying to myself, in a similar way that when you think about the, Edmund Pettus Bridge, like that was a moment when the world saw in a different way the suffering of Black people, the ways in which hoses were put on us dogs, and right. So all of a sudden the consciousness of the nation woke up in a different type of way in that moment because a light was shown on the ways that Black folks experience reality. And so when I thought about the ways in which these Black men in my book experience their emotional and psychological reality, I said to myself, oh my gosh, if the nation knew like as a whole and experience how Black men experience their emotional realities, it would be a crisis, and it would be an uprising to say that this is not okay for Black men to suffer this much emotionally and psychologically. And so I just want to name some of the themes that he raised from Black men feeling chronically dissed. And so one is this whole thing of not being known. So essentially, they named that, hey, they just see me. So much of my experience at the rental car dealership, like all they saw was this Black dude with a hoodie on. They didn't know anything about my background, right? But they saw me as someone who was automatically a threat, who was trespassing, who was being aggressive. But it wasn't until this white cop asked me more questions. And he was like, "Oh wow, like you're a professor at Willamette University, like how cool is that, right?" So he then knew me. But this is a theme over and over again with Black men in my book, that, well, you first gotta show who you are. Like you don't receive this automatic pass, so to speak, or this automatic validation. You gotta prove that you're human first before we treat you with respect. Another one was being looked at like we're monsters. So this was a general theme in terms of being looked at like they were something to be feared. The way one guy put it, as we were having a conversation there on the South Side, he was like, yeah, like they look at us like we're monsters, and they, when they see us, they go somewhere else to avoid us. And then another thing was being questioned and being excluded from groups. So this to me again goes back to like when you're questioned and you're excluded from certain groups and not receiving access, then like you don't have fair opportunities to both survive and to flourish. And then this last theme here is around being expected to act a certain way, right? And so there's a way in which a number of the men in my book talked about, yeah, like they just expect, people just expect you as a Black man to act a certain way. And so when you're acting differently, different than the image they have of you as like someone who's dumb or who's a threat, or whatever their imagination might be about Black men, they're like, well, wait a minute, like that's not the way you're supposed to act. So that's another obstacle. And one of the things I think is so important is the need to, what we talk about certainly in the field of psychology, is projective identification. So the need to resist projective identification. So for instance, I remember, and I tell this to some folks, when I first started working at Third Baptist Church of Chicago, there was a way in which, like as soon as I walk in the door, like people would just be like, hey, Reverend Greer, right? So there was a way in which it's like they saw me in a very deep and profound way in which I feel like, oh, it was then easy for me to show up in caring and loving ways. Like I didn't have to prove something otherwise, but I could just show up as my authentic self. The thing that projective identification does not do for us is that when someone projects onto a Black man that you're dumb, that you're criminal, that you're a boy, that you're not, that you're to be feared, then like all of a sudden it's like you're having to resist that. And sometimes it just gets downright exhausting having to resist. And when I've talked to some Black men, some of just kind of mentioned that, like, yeah, sometimes like maybe I should just like be what they want me to be. And when being what they want me to be is to be someone who's dumb, who's incarcerated, who's locked up, right? Like that's a significant barrier to survival and flourishing. And then I want to name the ways in which a number of the men responded to these chronic experiences of being dissed, or in other words, of being disregarded, discredited, feared and devalued. So a number of them engaged in some type of meditation, right, or some type of prayer or spiritual practice that helped them to reflect on, okay, what's happening right now. So in the same way that like these guys were aggressively talking to me at this rental car place, I actually literally took a moment when I was like, whoa, like what's happening? Like when I feel like they were talking to me as if they were members of the KKK. And I was like, whoa, what's happening right now? So I literally took a number of seconds to just like pause and reflect. And that was helpful for me to consider like what's happening right now. How do I need to respond? So this meditation was one of the ways in which I find helpful, and also men in my book found helpful to respond. And then one of the ways they responded was by proving folks wrong with positivity and intelligence, right? So showing that, I'm not who you think I am. I'm not who you say I am. And it's interesting that came up because I remember one of my mentors in coming through a PhD program, and he actually named this, that this was something that he did as a Black man, was that like he just he was like, I just read the whole dictionary, and I made sure that like I was well read, so that like couldn't nobody come against me and say that I didn't belong, right? So this whole proving wrong with positivity and intelligence is something that a number of Black men embody. And then, they're like, hey, we need to present other life options for especially, Black youth, to show that, hey, like there are other possibilities than the life limiting ones that you're seeing. And then this piece here, right, cutting people out, right? So there was this common sentiment that, for instance, if, Black men felt like there were people in their lives who were holding them back, they would just cut people out of their lives because they're like, hey, like this is not helpful for my life. So we don't have time to go into some full small group discussion because I want to invite us to reflect here together. But I would like you all to reflect on these two questions. How have men in your life been chronically dissed, right? I mean, like this is not just some abstract thing, right? We all, whether we're Black men ourselves or we have Black men in our families, in our communities, like when you think about their lives, what are ways that they have been chronically disregarded, right? Like I can think about the ways in which my father, he's technically my stepdad, but I call him dad because he came into my life at 4 years old and raised me with my mom. And when I think about the ways in which I remember seeing him constantly looked over, and the ways in which I feel like I saw him hurt, right? Like there are ways in which he experienced that. One of my uncles, former pastor of Second Baptist, Mark Dennis, I remember him telling the story of the ways in which he was going fishing with his children when he was younger. And, as he was out there in the water going fishing, a grown man, he was like, there was this white guy who looked at him and said, boy, what you doing out here? Right. And he talked about the ways in which that was so humiliating to him. He was like, I'm this full grown man and this white guy in front of my children, in front of my wife, is telling me, boy, like, what you doing out here? Right. So there are ways in which people we know have been Black men we know have been chronically dissed. And then you can reflect on how have the Black men you've known in your life, how have they responded to being chronically disregarded, disrespected, discredited, feared, and devalued? And so even as we look at nurturing ways for Black men to experience healing and to flourish, I think it's important to pay attention to the ways in which Black men up until now, the ways in which our Black male ancestors even have experienced being chronically dissed, and the ways in which they've responded to it. Because to me, that grounds us, and that grounds us for developing ways for caring for Black men that are true to that experience and honor their lives as well. And then the last major theme I'll talk about here is that, hey, we've got to acknowledge the ways that, yeah, Black men have been chronically disregarded, disrespected, feared, and devalued, discredited. And also, like, there have been ways in which Black men have not, fully felt life the way that Black women feel it, or even like supported fully the ambitions of Black women. So the ways that showed up in the men in my book is that there's a theme in which Black men, identified. I'm sorry, y'all. That's a typo. It should be women. So they were identifying women as providers and protectors. And let me go through and fix that right now, because that'll drive me crazy if it's not if it's not fixed. All right, there we go. So there was a way in which they're identifying women as I'm sorry, I'm second guessing myself, y'all. This shows you how like oppression is messing me up. So this is correct. Yes, so they were identifying men as providers and protectors. So in other words, like, they saw that this was the role for men and not the role for women. So what does it mean for them to embody themselves as something that's not just a provider, not just a protector? So one of the arguments I make in this theme is that because they saw this as the primary way to be Black and male, that then when it came to being present with Black women, right, feeling life as Black women feel it, and supporting their own ambitions, that wasn't really a priority, because for them the priority was, I need to provide and I need to protect Black women. But if we reflect on, okay, how can we be something in addition to that, so that we can actually emotionally be present? We can emotionally be present with Black women and journey with them in very powerful ways. I think that's a very significant thing for us to nurture in Black men. And then again, there was this lack of empathy and support for the experiences and the ambitions of Black women, so that it grieved my heart to see the ways in which Black men in this book were, again, blaming in some moments the Black women for their own experiences and saying things like, women just have misdirected thinking or whatnot. I was like, wait a minute, like, what about their experiences caused them to feel and think as they do, right? So to me, this way of being Black and male needs to be dismantled. And then they saw Black women as people to bring pleasure to Black men, right? So they appreciated women for the pleasure that women bring to men, and as opposed to experiencing and journeying with Black women in a holistic way, right, where we acknowledge fully their experiences, where we support them, and where Black women themselves are leaders. And then lastly here, they identified women as mothering, loving, caring, and understanding. So these are the ways in which they saw the identities of Black women. So I raise this to say it's important for us to reflect on, how are Black men imagining what it means to be a Black woman, and how can Black men relate to Black women in a way that nurtures the well-being of Black women. All right, so my last slide. So as you see there, would love to hear what stood out to you and any of your reflections.
So thank you, Dr. Greer. One of the things that stood out for me was I foresee that in the Black church, that's a space where men flourish. Black men flourish, and I'm trying to help. I'm trying to understand, I guess, better, if that's a space where men flourish, why there is such a disconnect as it relates to women, leadership, having why there's a lack of empathy in that space, even though they're flourishing in that space. And there's the power dynamic of keeping women in a certain space in the church where they cannot step into fully their call. And this is not in every space, not in every church, but if men are flourishing in that space, how can they be insecure, and this is my word, about and not more supportive of allowing women to be who God has called them.
Wow, what an important question. And so I've seen this reality come up, over and over again. Like, so certainly at our Coloring Mental Health Collective conferences and community gatherings, as well as other programs that I've been a part of, like that, like I feel that in that reality for a number of Black women in the church, in such a way that obviously it's an urgent thing to dismantle in terms of the ways in which, when we think about the church as a whole and even Black communities as a whole, too often it's been oppressive to the realities of Black women. And so when you think about I'm going to bring this back to the identities of Black men. So if Black male identities are built upon a foundation that imagines ourselves or themselves in a way in which even unconsciously Black men see themselves as leaders more so than Black women, then it becomes difficult to untangle that from one's identity. I mean, it's similar to whiteness, the ways in which white folks come about their identity. So folks talk about white tears, in which white folks start crying when you start questioning like the ways in which they imagine the world. Well, I think some of that is there for Black men in terms of the word I think about is fragile. So I think because Black men can have fragile identities because of the ways in which society continues to put a metaphorical and literal knee on our necks, killing us.
Mm-hmm.
So,
right.
So like I need a place where like I'm not being killed, right? Where people see me, where they can feel me, where I can survive, etc. Right. So this is why for me it's so important to have a nuanced way of thinking about Black male identities, because it's like, yes, on one level, Black men, like we're suffering and we just need spaces where we're seen. So too often, the Black churches have been a space where Black men can feel like somebody, right? Where,
right.
Oh, I can be seen as Reverend Greer,
right.
And so what does it mean though, like for every person in the Black community, for a Black woman, for non gender binary identifying folks to be related to and experience as someone who can also flourish and has the same opportunities as Black men. So one of the ways that the theorists that I appreciated talked about it was what does it mean when a person's identity is built around what they call a negative self-object, right? I mean, these psychological terms are not always the most helpful, but essentially what that means and what the person was saying was when you think about so self-objects in that sense is equated to what are things, who are people in our lives, or what type of cultures are we tied to? So if you think about like being our identities wrapped around like negative cultures, our identities wrapped around oppressive ideologies, our identities wrapped around negative experiences with people. And so when you think about this whole notion, okay, if a Black man's identity is wrapped around this negative self-object, if you will, or wrapped around this negative oppression towards Black women, then it takes a lot to remove that, to disentangle that. So the practical imagery that this one theorist came up with, talking about, what happens when a person's identity is wrapped around that, negative experience, is that he's like, it's like, hey, if you think about a person like a seed. So if a seed is placed in the ground, and then it's planted next to a wooden fence. So if this seed then grows up to be a vine, well, then it's going to wrap around that wooden fence, and it's literally going to be part of that wooden fence. So to try to remove, so we think about the wooden fence as sexism, the wooden fence as Black machoism. So if my identity as a Black man is wrapped around this wooden fence, well, it's when you think about like a vine that has become enmeshed into a wooden fence, well, it's hard to separate it because it's become one and the same. And so when you try to separate a Black identity from the wooden fence of Black machoism or sexism, then it can feel like you're ripping apart that identity. And so I think it's important for us to reflect on how do we to detach ourselves from this wooden fence while yet still being whole.
Yeah. Dr. Greer, that's a great answer. And Reverend Dye, just, I think it's such a pressing and probing and critical question for this day and age. We have not outgrown what you have talked about. We are still suffering through that. And you were very kind in saying that there are some churches like that. I think the majority of churches are still like that and very, very problematic. And Dr. Greer, what I would potentially add to your brilliant summation is that what has happened with us in the Black church, with all of our uniqueness and with all of our innovation, we still model ourselves to a large degree after white churches, after the tradition, Protestantism particularly. The white church then created this model of male domination and patriarchy and all of that. So, within the church, and that's what we modeled ourselves after starting out. But to me, it goes deeper. There's another layer. And this is where we have a real challenge. I think that the white church then modeled their understanding of male domination and patriarchy within church tradition out of the Bible and their interpretation of the Bible. So what happens then is we have to go deep enough to look at the actual word of God and those stories in the Bible that seem to give some suggestion about male domination and patriarchy being the way of God, when in reality, it was one's hermeneutic and one's interpretation of those stories that created the patriarchy in the first place. So for me, I think the excitement is being able to say, we've got to stop modeling ourselves after our oppressor. And then we have to name our oppressor for misinterpreting what we understand to be the divine word of God. And we have to go into that word of God and come up with our own hermeneutic and our own exegesis that helps us to understand the full equality of genders, the full equality of all human beings, including not only male and female, but LGBTQ and Muslims and Jews and everybody else. So this is a big job that you have us starting out on.
Well, so I'm thinking about, so one of my current D-Min students, so he's working on this very thing about, sexism, Black machoism in the Black church. And so one of the things that we've been engaging is, just the way you named it, like, so these various interpretations of the Bible that are not helpful for the well-being of Black women and the entire Black community. And so one of the things that I find very helpful is to reflect on, hey, we just all need to be honest that we all pick and choose what we want from the Bible. Right? And we all pick and choose how we want to interpret that. I mean, maybe more of us are conscious about the ways that we're interpreting than others. In other words, for me, I'm very clear that, like, I'm not taking everything from from the Bible as helpful for my lives. Let me explain that. So, I think everything is helpful for informing us about the ways in which people have understood God, have interpreted God, and the ways in which they've experienced their lives. But for instance, like I'm not, coming up here saying, hey, slaves obey your masters, right? Like that's not my number one gospel text. My number one gospel text is not about cutting up concubines, right? Like all these things are in the Bible. Yeah. So I'm very clear that, hey, my number one lens is, my number one lens to interpret the Bible is, when Jesus talks about, I've come that you might have life and life more abundantly. Like, so that's how I interpret, scripture in terms of what I find is most helpful is what from this text can nurture abundant life or well-being, if you will, amongst people.
Yeah.
Right. Do we have any other comments or remarks, questions? Chime on in. We're getting near the end of our first session, but surely there must be other questions. Surely.
Yeah, questions or just thoughts. I mean, I always say that, like, the genius is in the room, right? So the genius is in this virtual space, and all of you have a significant, contribution. So we'd love to hear how you're thinking about this.
You know what? I find this whole topic very interesting because the more that we can discuss it, I think the more that we can try to formulate ways on how to strengthen our community. So yes, I just find it very fascinating, and I will definitely go out and pull a couple people and make sure that they are here next week.
Thanks. Yes.
Love it.
Good deal.
You're right. I mean, there's a lot of potential when we come together as a community to have these discussions and think about next steps.
Yeah. Yes. Dr. Greer, when you were mentioning ways that Black men have in dealing with all of this stuff, one of them that you mentioned, you talked about meditation, and then you talked about proving them wrong, and with positivity and intelligence. And that goes back to most of us on this line. When we're younger, we grew up and we had parents saying to us, you have to be twice as good. You have to, you have to almost be impeccable in order to get the same thing that your white peers are getting. And that was always a struggle for me as a young person. It seemed terribly unfair. It was unfair. And I think that we have a younger generation now, Dr. Greer, who've kind of tossed that out of the window. I think we have a younger generation of African Americans, I think rightfully so, who they're not hearing that. They're not, being twice as good and all of that. What they're trying to do is confront and change the system. Right. By being, as you have said so many times tonight, authentic to themselves. So I wonder what the balancing act is, not only, proving yourself, in terms of being accountable and saying, wait a minute, I don't have to prove myself to anybody. I'm comfortable in who I am, and they have to accept me for that. Is it a balancing act?
Yeah. I mean, it's a heck of a balancing act. So I'll first start off by saying that, what I'm presenting in the book is like a movement towards flourishing. And so, so for me, like, we first got to survive before any type of flourishing is possible. So we first got to survive, and then we can, hopefully, experience healing and then liberation, being free from, whatever is holding us back, and then we can ultimately flourish. And so when I think about this notion of proving them wrong with, intelligence and that, they're better than how people imagine them, well, to me, that's still in that survival, category, that survival dimension of life. So I do think that that's still going on for a number of Black men. I definitely, agree with you that you've got a number of folks also saying, like, forget this, like, I ain't got to prove nothing, like, this is who I am. So you have more conscious Black folks, right? And like, I still see in certain spaces, like, I can think about a couple of Black folks I engage who are, law school students, and the ways in which they are, constantly trying to show up in a particular way, right? Or even those who are, working on their PhDs or whatnot, are showing up in a way to, like, not only to prove, but it's like they know they have to be their best selves, right? And so I think part of this is realizing that, any Black person, and in this case, a Black man needs to have multiple tools on his tool belt to know how to survive, and then to be able to eventually thrive. So in other words, like there might be moments where like, like I have to engage in a certain way. I mean, this is not saying that like we're gonna like give in to anybody, but it's saying like I hear what you're saying, and like no, like I'm not who you think I am, right? So that's part of what I mean. Like sometimes we have to show up in ways where we resist. But also a part of that is that like I'm making a point to say that, hey, like because we're having to resist so often, we also need to have moments where we can experience emotional, psychological, and spiritual healing, and that has to happen over and over again. So in other words, it's not just a one-time thing where we resist, but we've got to have moments where we can experience healing, right? I mean, so that moment where the 2 squad cars, the cops came up on me, like I had a moment for at least 2 weeks where I was just like out of it emotionally, right? I mean, it wasn't the first time I had that type of experience, but I think there was a way in which that moment, like at least the first week, like I was just emotionally, like my feelings ranged from being pissed, from being angry, and then it settled into like being hurt. And that's something that we don't often talk about with Black men, is that often what that feeling that undergirds that feeling of being pissed and being angry is also being hurt. And so I remember shedding tears, and part of the thing that got me to shed tears was thinking about, and this was like long after I told my dad what happened. But the thing that caused me to respond with tears in the moment by myself in my bed was I remember the ways that my dad looked at me when I told him what happened to me at the rental car place. And here you got this big Black guy and my dad, and who some might see as strong Black man or whatnot, but I interpreted like the looks in his eyes was like sorrow, and like even though he didn't shed tears, it was like tears in his eyes, metaphorically, for knowing that this happened to his son. And so when I was in my bed this one evening, just remembering like the eyes of my dad on me and the ways in which he looked at me with sorrow, it caused me to cry, like and tap more into like the sadness that I had, that like here I am, just a Black man trying to like walk, and this is how it gets treated, right? So I think it's important for Black men to acknowledge that sadness and hurt as well. Not as a place to say that, hey, we're going to be powerless. Actually, tapping into those feelings of hurt and sadness can make us very powerful. The same ways in which we can tap into our anger in a constructive way, in a creative way, we can also tap into our hurt and our sadness in a very constructive and creative way.
I think that has to be, I guess, communicated more so. At least the men that I know internalize and keep it within, and not necessarily express it, even with their spouse or their person in their family or friend that they may be close to. They may not truly express what's hurting, what's the anger that they feel, or they may express, it's like one extreme to the other. It's like, I'm going to hold it or I'm going to let you have it. And so I trying to, like Pastor Neighbor said, trying to find that balance. You, as you also said, it's exhausting to always have to prove yourself and have to address over and over again with various people at various points in your life. And why do our men, and it happens for Black women too. So I really get it. And I think it still goes back to my question to you, if our men are being chronically dissed, why are they dissing our, their sisters, their partners, their Black women? We are in this together. So I think a conversation needs to continue and expand on how we support one another.
Absolutely. I love your last point. Like, why are Black men, again, we're not saying all Black men, but a majority of Black men,
Right.
why are majority of Black men relating to Black women in very life-limiting ways, very destructive ways? And so one of the books I was reading, I think it was Bell Hooks's book, We Real Cool, where she was like, I got tired of waiting on Black men to write a book about Black men that critiques that critiques patriarchy and sexism. And so she was like, I got tired of waiting on a Black man to write that book. So I wrote this book, and I hope that someone else, others will, continue this line of thinking. So I was actually, taking Bell Hooks' call seriously when I wrote my book, to say that, hey, like, this book needs to be a book that does exactly what Bell Hooks talks about in terms of developing like Black male identities that are free from, sexist, patriarchal, Black machoistic ways of being Black and male. So when you ask the question, how can Black men relate to and treat Black women in demeaning, life-limiting, and non-helpful ways? Well, for me, it gets back at like, what are the identities of Black men built upon? And can we nurture identities of Black men that are built upon listening deeply and feeling deeply the life as Black women feel it, and nurturing supporting the ambitions of Black women, and not looking at Black women as people only to pleasure Black men and only to serve Black men, right? So these are the things that came out of Black men in my book. And so I think it's important. And one of the things I was passionate about is to say that, hey, we must, if you will, to start a movement to nurture Black male identities that are free from the constraints of sexism, Black machoism, and patriarchy.
This has been so good, and we've only just begun, but we are at time, and I want to, I think if you want to give just a teaser, so to speak, of what our conversation will look like for next week, and I would hope that those that are in attendance, as DIT Spivey had said that he would also invite others, but bring your reflections, bring your questions as you have time in the days to come. Write down what your thoughts have been about this conversation, and bring that to the table next week. We really want to keep this conversation going and go deeper, go deeper, go deeper. And I'm so grateful to you, Dr. Greer, for this evening, and look forward to next evening. And so I shall close us out if there's nothing else, if there are any more remarks before we close out.
Yeah, I'll just say, it's been great, having conversation tonight and talking about these important things. And next week, really looking forward to talking about what the community can do to unapologetically nurture the care of Black men. And also, one of the things that helps me as a Black man to survive and experience healing and even flourish is music. So one of these weeks, either next week or the week after, you see I've got my piano behind me. Perhaps I'm going to play a little bit to integrate that. To integrate that into our work, because I find that the art to music is a necessary component to our well-being. It helps us to express ourselves fully and to create a world on our own terms.
And it's soothing to the soul. Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much. There's not any more comments. I shall pray us out. Lord God, in the name of Jesus, we thank you for this glorious evening. We are so grateful, Lord God, for the opportunity to have this discussion, Lord God. We're so grateful for Dr. Greer, Pastor Neighbors, and all and every person on this line, Lord God. We pray, Lord God, that you would continue to bring more and more people to and add to this conversation, Lord God. And we thank you, Lord God, for what you're doing in this space, in this time, and going forward through Jesus Christ. This is our prayer of thanks. And together we say, amen.
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 Great discussion, Reverend Greer. Enjoy it. I'm going to get the book.
Amen. See
Love
you all
it.
next week. Blessings.
Thank
y'all.
you.
Sounds good. Good to see everyone. So many familiar faces.